Way back in 2001, the world got a hold of Final Fantasy X. This was a very different entry to a series that you could quite frankly call different altogether. While a common thread was certainly shared, every Final Fantasy was different, sometimes setting itself in a traditional fantasy environment, sometimes in a bizarro industrial revolution, and even one time borderline in cyberpunk. But though Final Fantasy is one of the premier JRPG series, Final Fantasy X was one of the very first to absolutely center itself in more Asian ideas, as well as pretty much the only Final Fantasy that has any South Pacific Islanders or South Pacific Island-inspired locales in it. But that's not all that's different about it. In fact, there are quite a few standout things in this game that just seem to ensure that it lives on, both in video game discourse and in the hearts of many gamers over the years. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, let's talk about why Final Fantasy X was a big deal. Just before we start off, a quick disclaimer, there's going to be spoilers in this. Depending on how you consume games, the journey may be more important than the destination. If that's the case, I'm not saying you have to play it before watching this video, but obviously for certain people, I just want to make sure there's a massive spoiler warning here for you. So Final Fantasy, like I said, is a bit of an eclectic game series. There's a lot in it, a variety of things to do and see, but there are some overarching themes. The gameplay always maintains some variation on the old school turn-based JRPG template, albeit with various innovations throughout the series that have culminated in what is essentially a real-time game. But Final Fantasy X hadn't gotten there yet. In fact, they did some interesting stuff with the systems that might even be a bit contradictory to the evolution of Final Fantasy. However, I'd like to talk about systems in a moment. First, let's talk about what Final Fantasy X is about. If we're to take the plot literally, it's about a world that exists in a cycle. The cycle is that of destruction. The destruction is an inevitability in which society has to eventually survive, and the threat in the form of a monster that must be defeated and then is reborn. It's a cycle you ultimately take part in, and is in every way an inevitable apocalypse story. Now to take a look at it, it's also both the first and the last of several things. It's the last Final Fantasy game to use pre-rendered backgrounds, and it also didn't exclusively use pre-rendered backgrounds. It was the first to have some pretty cool 3D environments in it that weren't part of the world map. Whether the game intended to with its narrative of an inevitable apocalypse and rebirth, the game commented on what was ultimately happening with Final Fantasy. It had to develop and evolve with the times, but it didn't want to let go of what it was. There's a cycle in game development in which various trends and ideas seem to live on for a while and then eventually die. Something is birthed in its place that the same thing happens again with. And again, I'm not going to tell you that this was 100% intentional, but a lot of the leads on the game, from the character designer Tetsuya Nomura, pushing hard to include South Pacific as well as Taiwanese references and characters, to executive producer Hironobu Sakaguchi, attributing most of the success entirely to pushing the team in various different directions that they wouldn't have gone in on their own. There is a kind of rebirth subtext that I feel really can't be ignored. But the fact it was a swan song for a lot of the things that had carried the Final Fantasy series for a while also had that endearing sadness to it. I feel like a lot of these real-world events contributed to the overall feeling of the game. There's a bright, beautiful color palette and an attitude of fun with the game of blitzball and characters that were very jovial, while at the same time there's just an inevitability that causes this existential sadness that once you understand what the game is about, you begin to start questioning whether or not change is good, bad, inevitably cyclical, or something that you can break the mold and move on to something new and optimistic. It's so many different types of emotions and feelings at once that it's a bit overwhelming. And although this is something that had been attempted in Final Fantasy, certainly Final Fantasy VIII was meant to embody a lot of different types of emotions at once. I feel like this was where they got it right. It finally sort of all fit together, despite there being some truly bizarre moments in this game. Ultimately, the characters absolutely do break the cycle, but unfortunately to do that, so much of what the world was had to be recognized as fake, including the main character. Titus, you, the person who played through the game, who made all of the events, eventually ended up being revealed to be a sort of spirit/dream combo, a relic of a previous world that had been destroyed by sin, kept alive only by the fact that the sin apocalypse cycle itself continued. This was unknown to both the player and the character himself, and ultimately required a sort of resignation to fate that Final Fantasy had never really asked of the player. A complex one that you actually didn't have to pretend in order to understand. And ultimately it tells us something about our world, a world that does have very cyclical change. And ultimately Final Fantasy X is about breaking the cycle, not returning to previous modes of existence, but instead treading new ground that no one really knows what to do with, and it acknowledges the kinds of losses that may happen along the way. Mechanically speaking, there's a lot to go around as far as fun goes. Final Fantasy X's battle system is not an active time battle system. It is not purely turn-based either. Instead, the developers opted for something they called a conditional turn-based battle system. There is no time pressure to make a move, so moves can be as strategically placed as you want. Also, the graphical timeline of which move is coming next made an appearance here. Conditional turn-based battle really does a phenomenal job of requiring lots of thought from you without pressuring you to make a decision. You're asked to make the best decision possible, not the fastest decision possible. And this isn't necessarily the way that the games developed after Final Fantasy X either. Like I said, we ultimately landed on Final Fantasy XV, which is a real-time game, which again is an interesting development and influenced a lot of JRPGs that have happened since. There was also a big change in how summons works, where they would actually just join the party in place of the person who summoned them, which again, given the changes to the battle system, did some really interesting things in my opinion. Instead of a class-based system, there was something called a sphere grid, which is essentially a grid of different options that one can take that eventually essentially linked everybody to every conceivable job or power, and allowed pretty much any character to transition into a different role. This happened gradually by traveling throughout the grid, traversing through different areas of power, and ultimately adding yet another layer of strategy to the game. Final Fantasy X also did away with the concept of a world map. Pretty much the entire game exists on a single path, and although you can move back and forth through that path, ultimately travel is very, well, travel-like until you get an airship later in the game. There's more than a couple mini-games, but the most notable is obviously Blitzball, an in-game sport who the main character is essentially a star of, at least in the dream world that he exists as a part of. Early in the game you have to play it, later in the game you can play it whenever you want. It's a fun game. And through every single moment of the game, there are these absolutely beautiful orchestral soundtracks by veteran Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu. In terms of impact, Final Fantasy X had a big one. In fact, it was the very first Final Fantasy game from its main line to have a direct sequel titled Final Fantasy X-2, which sounds bizarre. If you have the opportunity to play the HD remake of Final Fantasy X, you absolutely should. Final Fantasy X is a game that stands on its own as a title in the Final Fantasy franchise that offered some kind of commentary on, I think, more than anybody really knew who was putting time into making the game. Final Fantasy X's willingness to not just tackle something new, but advocate for something new, and make us feel the emotional need for something new, as well as understanding the underlying sacrifice that would be required for something new. It's all there, and it was a big deal because I think a lot of people picked up on all of this. It managed not to abandon what Final Fantasy is, while also telling us that there needs to be more. We need to try new things. We need to keep mixing things up. I would say that Final Fantasy as a series has heeded these lessons, and Final Fantasy XV is a great game. It's certainly the result of them wanting to try new things while not throwing out things that work very well. And yes, certainly you could say that the entirety of Final Fantasy is that, but Final Fantasy X kind of re-cemented it and embodied that ethos in such a way that there's more we could probably glean from this game than just, here's how taking risks and trying new things is good for games, but just how it's good for people. It's a very human lesson, and I think it's worth taking the time to think about more. Are you an old school fan, or maybe did you discover this game sometime in the last few years? What does Final Fantasy X mean to you? Leave us a comment and tell us what you think. If you like this video, click the like button. If you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them is, of course, a subscription. As usual, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.